march along this path of ambitious, forceful tides. I'll be dead before it crashes down before my eyes.
So hello and welcome to what will be episode 113 of Rebel City Podcast. Tonight actually, we're about our comfort zone there, usually a bit earlier done with these. We're joined by Nik Williams and Stephen Macleod. Hi guys, nice to meet you.
Hey.
So today we're going to be talking a topic that we've touched on in a few other bits and bobs in the past, and try to just delve a wee bit deeper. Disinformation. My interest in this is, well, I mean, I've been into politics for ages. Always have, studied at uni in various bits and bobs myself. And the last couple of years, it seems to be something that is becoming increasingly more and more prevalent. We've obviously got, like big examples in, sort of like Trump and Cambridge Analytica, which we'll get into, lately things like QAnon, and it's becoming part of like the discourse. So I think I want to be in a position where we can talk to our audience about how they spot it, because we're all getting exposed to it, how maybe down the line we can look to address these things on a sort of wider scale, and we know absolutely nothing about any of that type of stuff. So it's always better to get a guy in, or two in this case, you know what I mean?
When do they arrive?
There's never a bigger, more insult than when your missus says to you, we should get a man in. You're like, all right, okay.
So guys, it's nice to meet you. Thanks very much for coming in. I don't know if we'll do the whole round the table nonsense where if you might just take a wee minute just to introduce yourselves.
Oh, yes, I'm Nik. I'm the Journalist Protection Advisor for the Coalition for Women in Journalism. I'm also a reader director at the Ferret, which is an online investigative journalism platform based in Scotland. And I've done a lot of work on journalist protection work across Europe and broader free speech, free expression work here in Scotland. That's how I met this reprobate, Stephen, looking at sort of hate speech legislation and how hate speech can operate within freedom of expression parameters.
Okay, interesting. Just got you in when we were talking about the Offensive Behaviour Act a couple of years ago then, with the looks of it.
Oh, that shit's fucking brutal.
I'm Stephen. I'm a lawyer from Glasgow. You can tell by the accent maybe. Although he's from Glasgow now, I guess.
Yeah, you can't tell with my thick bro.
That's how we actually met in Brussels, and it was weird because he was like, "Oh, I'm here from Scottish Pen." I was like, "That's weird. I should know who you are." But I'm a lawyer from Glasgow. I specialise in kind of freedom of expression and online stuff. I work for a couple of companies who shall remain nameless for now, in case they listen. But I also lecture in IT law at CFWIJ Uni, particularly e-commerce law and kind of content moderation and that sort of stuff.
Outstanding. So in terms of sort of disinformation, what is you was, I don't know what I say about it to get it started,
Well, what is it?
Aye.
I think that'd be a good thing. What is disinformation?
I watched a couple of lectures and stuff in the build up to this, and every single one of them used the analogy that it was essentially a term coined by Stalin. That seems to be fact number one, even though obviously it's something that goes sort of way beyond that. So
all that's fair is blame Stalin.
well, I mean, you're not going to go far wrong with that a lot of the time, are you? You know what I mean? So we don't need the Stalin fact, but
I think for definitional work we should pass on to the lawyer.
Aye, very good. I think that's kind of the biggest question about all of this is what do you mean by disinformation? Because there's disinformation, there's misinformation, there's fake news, which has kind of gone out of popularity. But that was kind of the term that kicked off this, interest in things. And at first, interestingly enough, it came about when Trump won, and it was being used by opponents of Trump, saying that Trump won the election helped by the proliferation of fake news.
All right.
And there was lots of discussions in Silicon Valley at that point about, how do we combat fake news? Because if it's going to help, extremists such as Trump win, then what can we do about it? And one of my arguments at the time was the problem with a term like that you don't define or can't define is that everybody uses their own meanings of that term.
Yeah.
And it leaves it open to someone to come and co-opt it, which, surprise, surprise, Trump did. Within 2 weeks, thank God, because if it had gone on longer, then I wouldn't have been quite as
Kind of a genius
easily
move,
proofread.
really, isn't it? To
Oh, it was
use what's
unbelievable.
been sort of the shit that's been slung at you, you just sort of like grab it and then throw it straight back.
Aye.
It's like a classic tactic, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And so now fake news has kind of fallen out of popularity because of that. But instead we use misinformation, disinformation. So anytime there's any question about that, that is my, the first thing is, that is an academic thing. Define your terms. Like, what are you talking about? We're talking about Nigel Farage and his posters of Turkish immigrants. Are we talking about, the big bus with NHS?
Yep.
Promise of funds and Brexit, etc. And I think that's kind of the biggest question, because I think all too often we associate it with that stuff, or we associate it with kind of conspiracy theories, but it's a much wider question, which goes into even things like your granny posting something, on Facebook that she read that might not be all out like corrupt news or, propaganda type stuff, but could be viewed in an alternative way.
Yeah, spreading like this, and I think like in more extreme society should probably be punished quite badly for that. But so it seems like there's innocent mis and disinformation, and there's like sort of the more sinister, deliberate, like you're talking like propaganda.
Well, because that's the definition. One of the definitions I'd heard is like misinformation is like the granny like parents who have shared stuff not knowing it's false, but propagating it. And then there's disinformation, which is far more motivated by skewing discourse or targeting certain groups or things like that as well. I mean, that's a definition. I would argue that fake news hasn't necessarily gone out of fashion, maybe in the common vernacular, but the real problem we see it in journalism is it's being recycled as a term to target journalists. Yeah, and you're seeing it in laws. I think it's the Philippines, Singapore, Venezuela, Russia they've taken, for example, NetzDG, which is
quite surprising because they're all quite liberal countries.
Yeah, but this is the problem. So you have Germany's designed NetzDG to target hate speech. So the idea being that social media platforms were compelled within 24 hours to take down hate speech once they received a complaint. And it's still in force. They're reforming it. They've been going through a series of reforms. I don't know what the reforms will look like.
Yeah.
It was one of the leading policies of its type. You've had other countries like, the European Union more broadly have been looking at it. I know the UK has sort of looked at variants of it as well. And this is the problem when you have progressive multi-party democracies like Germany bringing forward laws like this. You have countries with far weaker rule of law, far weaker democracies, and far weaker respect for human rights, looking at it and co-opting it and taking it, pulling out what safeguards there were. Same thing happened in the UK. UK passed the Investigatory Powers Act, one of the most ambitious surveillance reforms seen in modern society. And the first two countries to comment on it were China and Russia. Again, two countries you don't really want to be on your side when you're talking about surveillance.
No.
And so we're now looking at NetzDG being co-opted by states that are, generally very, very weak democratic principles. And you have this law it's incredibly powerful. But one of the first people to fall foul of NetzDG I love was the Minister of Justice who brought it forward, Heiko Maas, fell victim to his own law, because he had his post removed for calling what I think was a racist or at least an anti-immigration campaigner an idiot. And he fell foul of NetzDG. A pro-refugee NGO was satirizing far-right, posting to show what sort of messaging they use. They fell foul of it, as well as AfD politicians have as well.
So essentially what they invented to protect them is now being used to beat them back. Yeah,
and it's the problem with this ambitious legislation around online platforms and online spaces, and it's going to get even worse when it gets far more automated as well, and that's a whole other thing that'll get it a lot more confusing as well. So we need to see how some of these countries explicitly call either fake news or false news or they may skew it, but it's the root is in the same sort of source material. And I mean, my definition of fake news really has nothing to do with falsehood, or it's information or content that threatens consolidated power. I think that for me is a fake news definition that I think still holds. It has nothing to do with falsehood, and it has nothing that I think is requiring any sort of legislative enforcement from a functional democracy.
Fair enough. I mean, we were joking in the wee sort of build up to this, and one of them that one of the things that had become obvious to me was that anybody who has any sort of learning on this absolutely despises the term fake news.
Yeah,
and the conclusion we came to was just, it's got to be that everybody just hates Trump, but now having had two totally different definitions for yous, I'm more inclined to think it's just because it means basically nothing on its own without your own sort of context.
Yeah, but the thing that I just came out of St George's Cross subway station, and there was an ad for some sort of hoodie or something, and not on the clothes, but the tagline was this isn't fake news. Then the jumper name and how much it was. And I was like, I should have taken a photo because it was really fucking appropriate for where I was walking. But I don't think that ad person is really up on it. Their sort of contemporary terms that would really sort of flog your shit.
I think the problem is that people see things that they disagree with or that they feel are causing them, personal strife, whether it's like removed from them or politically or whatever, and they want something to be done about it. And one of the catch-all kind of things is, fake news, misinformation, disinformation. Someone has to do something about that. And often it'll be people who are in position, not pointing at you by the way, but people gesticulating wildly, but people in positions in government or people in, who they've come to that point, but they haven't defined what the disinformation or misinformation is. So it's jump to stage 3 rather than addressing, what are the actual, even if you look at the online harms bill, the UK online harms bill, there's categories of well defined, which there's some in there are dubious, but then there's I can't remember what phrase they use, but something like don't have a clear definition, and it's disinformation. And this is still stuff that's been included within the online harms bill, and so they don't even have a definition of the kind.
So trying to legislate against something that
they can't define,
in the actual bills they can't define.
Right.
That is. Aye.
So you can see well, very much so, because you can see why it could just be, like you're saying, co-opted and manipulated to do whatever they want to do, rather than it to stop what people would probably think is online abuse and trolling and all these things that are big issues on the internet. But it seems so vague that it could be used in any sort of circumstance.
And there's so many different parameters. You don't handle a family member sharing something they think's real, but it's not, the same way you do a foreign country who's flooding your airwaves or whatever with targeted. They're very, very different responses. One is far more heavily based on literacy and how you interpret news, and also engaging that we all do it as well. If you have an issue where it's already complicated, it's already hard to define, it's already very emotionally charged, I've done it, and then having to delete it when on a family WhatsApp group, something that seems, on the first smell, seems true. Then you realise actually it's not. That's not malicious activity. Yeah. There's ways that we do need to ensure people do share or do propagate stuff that is authentic, but you don't do that through legislation. And legislation can't. I don't think legislation is well placed, especially legislation passed by our current government, where these things are so complicated as well. But at the same time, do we even want to really fix definition on this as well? That's the other thing. We can't define it because they're not even willing to do the legwork to define it. But at the same time, how do we define it? I think that's the other side of the coin that is harder for us to.
I think one of the things in terms of in the build up to this and doing a wee bit of research myself, that the term disinformation was, and did cover definitions of misinformation and various other aspects of it. But disinformation, for me, the conclusion I came to was that something that is intended for a specific purpose, but also kind of has an element of the truth to it. And I think you were just touching on that there, where it's not always as easy as when Granny's sharing Britain First posts and you're like, come on, they're fascists, let's stop that. You know what I mean? Yeah. But what concerns me about it all, and this is where we want to have this conversation, is that a day in history and things through the years, when I hear the term disinformation, I'm taken back to a secondary school history class where they're talking about dropping leaflets or, you know, trenches in World War One about what your wives are doing while you're stuck in a trench and all that kind of. My understanding, it's always been very sort of militaristic. That it was
like having the BBC on board a naval ship, as they did last week, with where they went through the Crimean Sea, and it was like, just so happened that the BBC had a reporter on while they were doing it, and it's this whole state-based propaganda war against Russia and their, you know, occupation or annexation of Crimea.
Yeah, I completely missed that.
But none of the statutory stuff addresses any of this, and that's why I'm kind of flippant about definitions, because internationally there's definitions, you know, people use them differently. They won't mean the legal definition in their jurisdiction, even if they know what it is. And then we have, you know, I briefly mentioned the kind of promises about the NHS money. None of that stuff is really addressed in the focus on misinformation. It's more about people saying, you know, you shouldn't wear a mask, or, you know, and I think that's my big concern, is we don't see the same focus on the big stuff that actually matters.
So it's like the stuff that kind of matters, because that's what I was thinking earlier when you were saying about like the Brexit stuff and the misinformation, and or like the side of the bus, and, you know, like Farage and his big billboard that's famous. That's the stuff that you kind of want the truth on. Your cousin sharing, you know, COVID denial stuff, that's kind of easily dealt with, you know. It's like you're saying, it's ignorance, it's no malicious. People are thinking these things are actually built to get an emotional response, and then they get an emotional response and everybody starts arguing about it. You know, like that's the type of stuff that you can kind of deal with on an individual basis, but it's the big stuff. And when the BBC are so closely involved with the government, it's hard for you not to think that they're just basically a propaganda machine. And I think that's why Trump's message was so powerful, because the amount of truth that was in it was shocking. Like,
well, I don't know whether it's truth. I mean, I have huge issues. You know, like I would say, like there's elements of management in BBC that has problematic, and obviously it's been slowly captured by different sort of mechanisms. And we have ministers and who have talked about bringing BBC closer towards government, as well as selling off Channel 4. You know, so we have. So a lot of this is the background to this is also the hollowing out of independent, either state and non-state entities. We have the hollowing out of entities like the BBC, but we also have the defunding. Well, not the defunding, but the failing financial stability of independent newspapers as well. We also have, I mean, things like the sort of like things on the online safety bill, things like that, and any legislation around disinformation. You know, if we had, for example, so the 350 million on the side of the bus, if we had a far more muscular elections regulator, we wouldn't need this behemoth of this tentacled beast that would be any form of disinformation legislation. We would be able to, but I think also, say subconsciously, we've also internalized, and we've, to be fair, had loads of evidence to feed it that politicians are inherently distrustful. I don't believe it as a whole. Like there's unfortunately way too much evidence of individual. But then, so when you have that, it's almost like, well, they already think we're that, so why not lean into it? And because we expect politicians to lie, when we see that, we hive that off from this conversation about disinformation, and then actually what that does, it enables the state or Facebook, people like that, to actually define the terms. And as soon as they define the terms, the fight is sort of halfway lost as well.
I think the truth that I was alluding to there is more that, you know, you could go and pick 10 big stories and just show how one side gives one narrative and another side gives another. So they're lying to you, and then people take 2 and 2 and come up with 1 billion, you know, and we've seen that very recently, how people's distrust, and you can quite easily go and find these examples and go, well, look here, and then people can, you know, the amount of times that I've seen, well, politicians are lying to you, look at this example, and it's like, well, what, like, that's how I would combat it. Well, what politician are you referring to? And like, can we be specific? Because I've sat across the table for many of them, interviewing them, and they're lovely people. So who are we speaking about and what are we speaking about? So I think when I was saying that there's a truth to what Trump was saying with the sort of fake news sort of thing, is that you can quite easily go and show where, you know, Fox have backed the right and, you know, NBC have backed the left, no matter what they've done. And stuff that Trump did in government is so wholesale out of order, but when you look at it, they've all been doing it for like, you know, he's just perpetuating the same shit. It's just that one side has an exception with him or like who he is and that type of thing. That's what I was meaning by, that's how they convince people is that they go, well, look at this, and you go, well, if they lied about that, surely they must be lying about this. Not necessarily, you know, and that's how conspiracy theories are being really pushed onto people, you know.
Some absolute nonsense.
But it's also as well, you know, we have a country with that where basically most of, say for example, the newspapers are owned by 4 companies.
Yeah.
Again, this is like where legislation around disinformation won't get you anywhere, but better media regulation, a more pluralist media environment, far more, you know, a healthier dynamic. So you have local newspapers that aren't all owned by the same company.
Yeah.
You have more independent outlets. You have sustainable funding models. A lot of that will diversify the sources of information, and it also chip away at this narrative of all newspapers are in certain politicians' pockets. Things like that. So these are all things that I think, because everything that we're looking at, whether it's things like NetsDG or any automated fake news filters or algorithmic capturing of whatever, is just catching the symptoms, not the actual cause. And the actual cause is a hollowing out of public trust in institutions, no media and information literacy put forward in any curriculum that we're really seeing. And the sort of homogenization of the media environment. And all this stuff can be tackled, but it won't be tackled by just looking at disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, or fake news, or whatever.
But then I think that's maybe largely the goal of the disinformation that we're talking about, is to create that instability and hollowing out. Because again, not to go back to the Stalin example, but you know, a lot of these things that I was reading and watching in the build up to this talk about that deliberate sort of state of flux, and it creates so much noise. And this is where my concern is because, as I say, I initially think about it in very militaristic terms, but I believe now that all over the world politicians are weaponizing this to create levels of instability that are actually now really starting to impact other people's lives. And we do frame it in very like, oh, Russia and China and blah blah blah, but like it's not just happening here, it's happened here. Like I think in some of the notes I sent over here, like I briefly touched on like Cambridge Analytica and obviously, you know, the vote leave and these types of things. And like in that instance, for anybody that doesn't know, the basic gist was that the data that you have on places like Facebook and, you know, other social media was harvested to target very specific people and very specific demographics on very specific issues that they thought would act as wedges that would increase the vote. Now, if any other country in the world had done that to the British population, we would probably be calling it an act of psychological warfare. But at the moment, a huge swathe of the people that are involved in that process, well, one of them is the Prime Minister, you know what I mean, and the rest of his cronies. So there has been there was reactions, there was, you know, obviously the press were all over it, I'm sure there was inquiries and hearings, or maybe they're starting to happen, but at the same time, the end result was that I don't remember anybody going to prison, I don't remember anybody, maybe some like election fines where, you know, you break election rules and you get like a 70 grand slap on the wrist, but you've got like whatever £5 million in donations for like Russian oligarchs, you know what I mean? Like, so, like, I think more than ever, we need to approach it from the point of view where people need to know that this is happening, how to, you know, deal with it and stuff like that. So, like, I mean, how did we get to a point where such a flagrant, like, just attack on us was allowed to just sort of come to pass? Is that too big a question?
Sorry. I think that's the question, I think. Stephen?
Oh, thanks, Nick. I mean, the obvious answer to that is that these companies, should say, certain companies traffic in data. That's the whole thing. And the mass collection of user data without adequate privacy standards across the globe is what resulted in the ability to target people in a very, very specific manner. And like you were alluding to the fact that, I mean, the Brexit vote was basically a trial run for the 2016 election in America. It's the same company that did it, and they used the exact same tactics based on what they'd learned in the UK. And I mean, they targeted, rich white areas with very blatant ads about Hillary will come, and then black people will, come in, move into your area and commit violence against your children. Like really, like blunt, not like things we would never expect to see in Facebook.
This is not nuanced. That wasn't nuanced, was it?
No, it was extremely. And so how it happened in terms of how it was able to happen is that. And now Facebook have, as a result, limited the gradation of which you can target people. I mean, I used to be able to go on and, target like...
So you can still target people, you just slightly less.
And of course, that's like... I don't want to question Facebook's ethics or anything, but there is,
I don't think I ever hear Stephen say that.
Just because we can't target people to that level, I mean, none of this stuff was being done, in an ethical fashion in the first place. That doesn't mean that those who are much larger advertisers don't have access to much more. I mean, they do. They've all got their farms of, data that they tap into, and just because you don't. The kind of big misconception is that, if each individual thing is what tracks you, so YouTube won't know if you're on this site or whatever, but there's companies that essentially take all of that data and infer who you are based on completely random sources of, you could visit one site, not be logged into Facebook or whatever else, but it'll collate it. And there's obviously restrictions around that, but in reality it's quite easy to do if you've got a global view on the internet and what people are doing. So that's the status. That's how it was able to happen in a technical sense.
But I think even before that as well, though, we've had this, it's the whole, even like watchdogs. There's been very little enforcement power when disinformation has been embedded within the state or influential actors as well. And things like, was it this? I can't remember which tabloid it was, and I won't say it just in case I'm wrong. The headline was a proportion of British Muslims had sympathies for Al Qaeda or
the Taliban at the time. Or something
I can't remember. It was flagrant. It was flagrant falsehood. It was shown to be a falsehood. But the correction was like that big in page 3. And so no one reads that, and then you get to the and you do the same thing with the fines that have been meted out against Facebook. It becomes a question of the amount of money the company will receive from selling that will vastly outweigh the fine that they would receive. And so we need to say, like, if there are falsehoods like this, my opinion is if your front page, if your headline is a falsehood, the correction should be the exact same position, font size, thing. It'll never happen.
Would it sell papers though? Sorry, we were wrong.
No, because no one reads the correction except for the people who already know it. Already know it. It's false.
It's vindicating for people to go and see. Look, I was right. But people are just skim past it.
And so all of these different things, and then we have the the expense scandal.
What
was it, 10 years ago, 12, 14 years ago, whenever that was.
In that ballpark, definitely.
It was
2009?
Cameron got in 2010, and I think it was a year after he got in. So they were talking like 2011, 2012, something like that.
And, so we've had all of these things that have just chipped away at the public sort of trust in the sort of democracy as seen through Parliament, because Parliament isn't itself democracy. Democracy is far bigger than that. And then so when you have so low levels of public trust, then you can sort of lean into it a little bit to your ends, and then you have these relationships with donors. Again, we have very lax election financing, and open democracy, and Peter Gagan's done a lot of work on that, and obviously a lot of other journalists. So all of this sort of stuff just fills this gap where enforcement and oversight should sit, and then again that also contributes to disconnect again.
Definitely.
And then that system just keeps rebuilding itself, and then it gets to the point. I find it, someone who sort of is interested in this topic, just being like just so defeated, and you see all this sort of stuff, and you're just like, oh, grand.
But I think that's a really important point, because the focus when we think about this stuff is often on the internet, and that's like in government's best interest to say, you know, tech companies need to fix this problem they've created. But the problem, you know, of a relative who only reads a certain newspaper, so always thinks certain things about certain,
absolutely,
has always existed.
With the Sun out in the 80s claiming to have won an election, so just this type of bullshit has just been happening all the time. It's just that now it's on the internet. Now we've got Netflix making documentaries about it. People like, but I think, like, to go back to what you're saying about being disheartened, what are we doing with all this extra information? We don't seem to be able to do anything with it. We're outraged that the MPs of, you know, spending 250 grand on a fucking kitchen or whatever it was that they did, but what have we done about it? We've done absolutely nothing, and we've voted the same people back in. It's almost like, I'm with you on that, where it's like, do I need to like completely disconnect myself for this? Because putting my focus and energy into it does nothing but make me just go, it's fucking pointless. Even
social media
you know?
presence would be significantly better if I could deal with the daily like culture war that is just thrown at us.
I think that's exactly. I think one of the kind of pre-conversation notes was about like, what do you do? And I think recently I've found myself quite disheartened in a way, because I feel I've always been politically engaged, but I'm now at the point where I don't get involved online anymore at all. And even in real life, quote unquote, I find myself completely like, I have a sphere of influence and I engage in that. But it becomes really clear, especially over the pandemic, that we move, you know, we used to talk about the 24-hour news cycle, but now it's literally 6 hours on Twitter, if that, constant. Every day there's something else we have to be outraged about, or that people are outraged about. And if I honestly can't understand how people can have that level of energy and like to remain engaged, whatever your position is.
I don't know, it's frenzy. I think it's mania.
And I think,
you know what I mean? Like,
part of the way to reclaim it is to find, I mean, the way I use the internet now is very different, and I use it for, I have stuff at work that I do, and then I do make music or something, and I go to forums where people talk about music. I don't, well, I say that, I have a whiskey and then
you're on
people. Exactly.
I would say something I remember actively is days gone by where I would have like political discussions, but then I realised at a point it became quite cyclical, because it became the yearly chat about poppies, and then the yearly chat about whatever, and the yearly chat about the next thing, and the next thing, the next thing, and it has, that cycle has compressed down into, like, as you say, like several times a day now, and I get why it's exhausting, because it exhausts me, and I think it's meant to.
It's also, but what I find worrying though is that, you know, there are people who can't afford to be able to take that, you know, whether it's like refugee communities, trans community, you know, where it is to be present is to actually sort of defend your protection under law, your existence in this country, or and that's a really hard thing as well. Like, you know, for example, in my work with the coalition, you know, you look at, you know, a lot of, far too many journalists have to get barrages of like online abuse. I mean, it is horrific. Like Patricia Devlin, a journalist in Northern Ireland, she had her infant son threatened with rape online by someone who signed off as Combat 18, which is a neo-Nazi movement. And then you have Mariana Spring, the disinformation journalist for the BBC, who's been likened to a paedophile, a Nazi propagandist, you know, all this sort of stuff. And when they're told, and it does disproportionately affect women and journalists of colour.
Absolutely.
And when they sort of talk about this, they say, well, just step away. Well, journalists, especially now, can't step away. That's part of their responsibility and part of their role. You know, journalists like, I would say, Patricia Devlin and Mariana have been very good about documenting it. Because the real problem that we find is that the atmosphere is so toxic against journalists, people internalize it. So they expect abuse with their job. It's normalized. They don't even acknowledge it as a threat anymore. Yeah. And that means you can't monitor it. You don't know what's out there because they don't really accept it as a threat. So they don't report it to either their employer or watchdogs and things like that. And again, so by them speaking out, I would say is a very powerful thing, but it then, without any sort of protection mechanisms, it's not there. I mean, Patricia Devlin's case, the police service in Northern Ireland, there's ridiculously compelling evidence they know who the person behind it is, and they've never even been questioned.
Wow.
And
Why?
I mean, to be fair, that's a far more complex conversation regarding sort of organised crime, sectarianism, and
the links to each other.
And the PSNI.
It's just basically corruption.
I don't know whether it's corruption. It could be corruption. It could be incompetence. It could be this sort of grey
combination of
area.
everything.
Or the sort of, or police always like to sort of suggest there's this grey area around online threats. I mean, threats of sexual violence against a child, against a journalist who's already vulnerable for her reporting in sectarian issues, I would say there's at least worth. There is an escalation that I would say in that context.
There needs to be a conversation at least.
An interesting situation pop up on my socials yesterday, and the girl's works for the BBC, funnily enough, but she's not a journalist. She does like production for BBC Social, and she's got a stalker that has like faked her nudes and put them all over like Reddit and stuff, and she's found them, and she went to the police, and the guy went, "Well, they're not real, so why are you upset?" And she's like, "Well, his colour matched my skin, and he's took real pictures of me, and all he's done is remove the clothes, and she's like, I mean, it's so realistic that my boyfriend couldn't even tell the difference, like when he was looking at them." So what the police attitude towards that is like, well, it was almost like it's a joke. That's a joke that you want to make a police complaint about somebody doing that. She's like, well, I've got this in place and whatever. She's clearly had years of history with this guy, but then like we're talking about, there's no protection for her in this weird online, and with deep fakes coming over the hill that are so hard to distinguish. Like, we really need to get a grip of this. Otherwise it will just, I feel like, just get out of absolute control.
I also don't think it's not real is really a defense in that. Even if it's obviously not real, that doesn't make it any less sinister.
Like, or upsetting for the individual.
That side of it. And I will say, like, BBC, I mean, I've seen it through, so NOS in Netherlands is the public broadcaster in the Netherlands, and they've had a lot of journalists there have had so much abuse, generally around like anti-lockdown protests, but a lot of other like right-wing and far-right-wing. They've had to remove all logos from their vans when they're traveling around to record stuff because the vans just
get attacked.
And a guy came in. He created this video saying that this is also where fake news comes in. They created this video saying that NOS is just fake news. That in itself, maybe 5 years before that, he had stormed one of their buildings and demanded to be put on air. And luckily he didn't, and they were able to get him out. And there's a study done in Australia. It said, again, the journalists that were most targeted by allegations of fake news was ABC, the Australian public broadcaster. So there is also this nexus around public service broadcasting that really, really drives a lot of sort of vitriol as well.
So essentially being the primary broadcaster in the country is making them merely a target as a result of this.
And for them, genuine mistakes, which every employee makes, is then suddenly automatically propaganda. Every editorial choice.
You see, there's quite a lot. I mean, even in the Yes movement in Scotland, you see quite a lot of this, where they're saying that the weather maps deliberately put an angle to minimise the landmass in Scotland compared to England, and that's my response to that. Is that feels like even if somebody's thinking on that level, it's like, what difference does it fucking make?
And it also covers. It also then gives cover for not genuine conversations about flaws in coverage, genuine issues that need to be addressed. I've worked for the last 4 or 5 years on journalist protection, free expression, and that's not to call out when there've been bad decisions made. But then when you have this atmosphere where everything is either propaganda or bad faith, you can't have genuine conversations about what needs to actually be looked at.
I think in terms of we were talking about the groups that need to like step out and defend themselves and find themselves in these situations. You touched on like the trans community, and I think similarly to what you were saying, where Brexit was almost like a sort of dry run for the 2016 election. I feel like some of the disinformation and some of the online just hellhole and nonsense that we're talking about here is being utilised in the UK against trans people in what is probably starting to feel like a very similar way. It's now being rolled out in America, where there's representatives who are very like anti-trans, and it's almost as if this is now the next sort of wedge that is being sort of prepared. Is that your experience? Because I know obviously you represent LGBTQI in some of your work?
Yeah, I have. I mean, I'm not particularly keen to talk about it and for it to be on the air, to be honest, just because I'm not trans myself, so I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of.
No problem.
But you are seeing, there has been, but there's also so many wedges we're seeing as well, though. I mean, it is obviously, this is, trans issue is definitely something, people, like protections of trans people in law, and gender recognition reform, but also things like how we visualize British history, how we incorporate our complicity to the slave trade, colonialism, how that's incorporated within Britain, what use of things like statues, how is all this sort of stuff, are all these sort of these wedges that are being used to, I would say, push not push the narrative, that sounds too conspiracy theorist, but to supercharge public discourse in ways that benefits certain policy decisions, and to obscure other policy decisions. It's very handy to demonize Black Lives Matter protests or Extinction Rebellion protests when you're looking at the police crime sentencing courts bill, which is looking at demonizing and making it very hard to peaceful protests. That we're only getting to where we're getting to on that because they have demonized protest movements.
So, we seem to be touching on a number of bits of various other legislation that seem to be sort of tangentially linked in it. Almost feels to me as though the disinformation we're talking about here is a tool that has been used to, or utilised to push other things like various other bits and pieces of legislation. Or, we've touched on the fact of how difficult it is to legislate, especially across jurisdictions with these things. Like, is there like an answer? Do we have a legal recourse that, or a framework that can be applied on a sort of global scale, or is it going to be up to each country to work this out for themselves and hope that there's some sort of best practice in the mix?
I think just before we got into that, I think the discussion there demonstrates how complex the whole thing is, because you're quite right to say, certain people, their existence online is a political kind of statement, or it becomes a political issue. And when I was thinking about it there, it was literally just the way you interact with the constant flux of information. But obviously that then bleeds over into questions of hate speech and hate crime and those things, which if you're, is a privileged position to be able to, it's things that are important to me, but I can go on Reddit without worrying about, being called a slur or whatever. And that's where it gets much more difficult, because even when you're involved in the field, it can be, the amount of crossover between everything begins to muddy the waters a bit. And I think when you're asking about, is there a framework? I think, no, there's no, this is the biggest question of internet governance and about these prevailing issues. They're not new, as we discussed, but they're being amplified. And so, for example, to give you, earlier on Twitter, there was a discussion going on, and there's two kind of, it's Glasgow local, somebody's coming on and saying, well, Glasgow's a dump now, what happened? There's rubbish everywhere. And you get lots of people going, aye, Glasgow is a dump. And behind that, there might be anti-SNP feelings, there might be, whatever. But everyone sees one vector, and, however many characters Twitter is now, can't mind, 248, 124?
256,
whatever it is.
240, I think.
Whatever.
I think 5.
A small amount, right? So they see that vector and they jump on. But at the same time, we've got a conversation going on about the same kind of area in Govan Hill, about it becoming gentrified. Yeah. And you're like, everybody else is jumping on that, going, it's gentrified, it's $2.70 for a cup of coffee and all that stuff. And these two things are not mutually exclusive. They can both be true. Yeah. But because people see that bit, there's no kind of crossover there. And if you go in and try and say,
it's going to be hard to be a gentrified shithole, isn't it?
Aye, but it could be
a couple of times. I'm pretty sure.
But that's the kind of the problem even within that. And so to have macro issues like that regulated at even at tech company level is I don't see any way that legislate. There's no global legislative body.
Yeah.
There are certain categories of content that are universally considered to be beyond the pale.
Yeah.
And even if there aren't local jurisdictional things, there's a common understanding that content, for example, child sexual abuse material.
course.
And so the actual specifics of the law don't matter, but when it comes down to everything else, there's no, there's basically Europe, the US, and then everywhere else is doing their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, even within Europe, we've got the Digital Services Act coming up.
Yep.
Digital Services. I've literally been working on this all week. Digital Services Act. But the problem is because it's because of the kind of European legislation it is, each member state will have their own implementation of it. Mm-hmm. So even within Europe, if you want to comply with those rules or those individual factors, I mean, the only companies that can do that are Facebook and Google. And so I don't know what the answer is to that, but what I would say is that the continuing fracturing of statutory obligations doesn't make the internet a better place. Right. Because each country says, well, we don't want this, but we don't want this kind of thing in this very specific way. And it doesn't actually solve the problem, especially when you've got the vast majority of companies who run the services we rely on are not Facebook and Google and do not have, tens of billions of resources.
And we have we have candidate countries to the EU that don't even acknowledge the existence of genocides that have happened within the European continent. Okay. We have EU members who passed law to stop conversation about complicity in the Holocaust. So even these foundational issues where we would think they're a certain sort of shared baseline, we don't have. So even how would you talk about disinformation, for example, around things like the Armenian genocide, when we have very powerful, influential states? You just don't even acknowledge that it's even happened. And then how then can you build a legislative basis that can ensure
this is the genocide that was it Biden? Did he?
Biden recently, because this was quite, so he, I think he's the first American president
there was a big deal about it,
to publicly identify it as.
Acknowledge that it happened.
Yeah, and then I think Erdogan said then that he was going to acknowledge the genocide of the Native Americans, which... All power to it. I mean, that is also a conversation that needs to be had. Not as a tit for tat. It's that's not a bludgeon to hit someone over the head with. That's a genuine issue.
Probably quite indicative of what we're talking about, where Erdogan, or however I pronounce it, has changed the narrative by just, as I say, these kind of almost Trump-esque, like flippant sort of remarks.
I see Trump wishes he was Erdogan.
Well,
I mean, Erdogan has exerted more power over Turkey than Trump could have fucking dreamed of.
Definitely.
I mean, what is it? 8 years since the attempted coup?
Is it as long as that?
I think it's 2013. I think.
Do you actually think that Trump wanted power, or I think Trump is just a fucking puppet? Like, I think he's just. I don't think him personally really gave much a shit about much of what was going on.
I think it was a publicity stunt that'll get out of hand. But
I think his vanity
propelled him.
I've never seen vanity be such a powerful driver.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think 2.0 might be. Who knows? Who knows? What the next
but it's things like he was an incompetent fascist. Well, maybe not fascist, but an incompetent authoritarian. What is the real problem with the US and other countries is when do you get someone who's not as idiotic as him? Like the Muslim ban. It lost at the Supreme Court, didn't it, I think? There was. Yes, if it wasn't that, but another one of his big policies lost pretty bad at the Supreme Court. But it wouldn't take a genius to reposition it slightly, change how it's presented for it to go through the checks and balances.
Absolutely,
and that's the real worry. But again, we're seeing that in Belarus, Turkey, Philippines, increasingly Hungary, in Poland. When you've got weak rule of law, when you've got no oversight mechanisms, you don't have to be as the sort of bravado, the loudness, as Trump did, because you can do it other ways and be also
silent
effective.
Power almost. So I mean, on the legislation side of things, it sounds as though the best we can hope for is almost some sort of patchwork that works for each individual company if they ever actually manage to even so much as define disinformation. But there are some countries out there that do quite well, and my reading and research before this, they all coincidentally obviously seem to share a border with Russia. So I think was it Vice or something? I can't remember. But they're saying that there's a number of like Estonia and various other Eastern European countries that actually handle media literacy and, you know, the sort of management of like disinformation significantly better. But I think that's primarily because sharing a border with Russia means that their population are exposed to sort of massive amounts of it. Now, obviously, that's the kind of territory I feel that we're sort of moving into. You touched on media literacy before. Like, I remember a time at school where we were told, like, you know, is that a reliable source? And is that now no longer a part of the conversation in education, or is it just that we need to now do significantly more?
I don't know whether it's not part of the... I don't have any kids, so I have no direct knowledge of the school. But I think the nature of... Because, you know, I think someone mentioned, you know, this the sort of proliferation of disinformation. You know, social media... blogging, you know, it has absolutely transformed how much information you engage with on a daily basis. So I think we need to look at this really, really seriously, like as a core part of the curriculum, not something that's like done the week before summer holidays and you've run out of films to watch and stuff like that. Like this is, but also like I remember we had very little teaching about like how our parliaments worked. You know, and I went to school back in England, South England, so I knew fuck all what happened in Scotland. You know, so like this broader sort of civic knowledge, as well as things like interrogation of sources, you know, how things are framed, what things to check, you know, and things that I think that's really, really important. I would say a far more healthier media environment, media landscape. So we have genuinely independent corroboration of news stories. It's harder to then paint journalists as just being, you know, a propaganda machine or a corporate behemoth owned by an offshore tycoon. That I think would make that conversation. And you'd also get a lot, because what's really interesting, while support for journalism has dropped, it's not, you know, it's still there. Support for local journalism is still ridiculously high. But again, they're the journalism that's most at risk. So we actually need conversations about sustainable funding models, things like that. So I think because I think that will transform, not right away, but I think it will set the foundation for a healthier engagement with the information around us, and demystifying a lot of things like, you know, things like algorithmic transparency, algorithmic auditing. So we know more. We won't know everything because the majority of it's proprietary. And all these platforms are capitalist Goliaths.
Do you think that's part of the problem?
I think, you know, I'm not saying for a socialist overtaking of Facebook, even though that'd be a hell of a news cycle. But we need to identify the fact that their motivation is not the strengthening of democracy. Their motivation is not connecting the world. Mm-hmm. It's, you know, their profits are more than the majority, like a large chunk of the world. And so that we need to see, and, you know, their responses to things is always reactive. So Facebook was highly culpable in the genocide in Myanmar. And it turns out, I think they had like a very small number of moderators who spoke Burmese.
So what happened there? Because I think this is probably one of the ones that people be like, what the fuck are they talking about?
I think I seen one of these on, it was John Oliver or something covered it, and it was, the spread of Facebook Messenger to spread misinformation about racial minorities that has eventually led to a genocide.
Yeah. Was it there where basically your access to the internet is Facebook?
Basically Facebook as well, because we also need to look at this. A number of countries, the internet is Facebook.
Yeah,
because Facebook have done deals with telecom providers and the infrastructure of that country to provide low-cost internet to the users. It fell foul eventually, I think, of net neutrality laws because it wasn't giving you the internet. It was giving you
literally
curated.
the plan of the bad guy for, like, you know, the Kingsman
Yeah,
movie. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Like, it's literally a Bond villain plan.
Yeah.
Like,
And then so Facebook was used to target Rohingya with, you know, this, and this wasn't, I would say this is not even the complex grey area of like explicit calls to arms to murder Rohingya. And it got into a really weird, like, I was reading in this book actually, which I recommend, I can't say this book because it's on radio, Gillian York's book, Silicon Values, is excellent on this whole conversation about sort of content moderation around hate speech and how it's been too focused on Europe and America. Global South have had no real input into how these rules are constructed. So to show how bad Facebook was, but then once they got their knuckles wrapped, they started then trying to dial it up. But things like, you know, this is where things like context. So there's this word in my Burmese called kalar. I think it's Kalar, which is used to target Rohingya. It's used as a slur, and it has been used in explicit calls to violence aimed at Rohingya.
yeah.
So Facebook banned the use of that word. The problem with Facebook's banning was that it was like it was reactive to negative press content. So they just didn't ban anything. The ban included posts that commented on the banning of the word were banned.
Okay.
And also, I don't know Burmese. Kala is also a word. I'm not going to even attempt the full name because I will probably insult everyone. But the Burmese word for vegetable and split pea soup includes the word kala, as well as another vegetarian dish with chickpeas in,
So there's
which is
also
kala.
innocuous meanings for it.
So you have like recipe posts being taken down.
Right.
And so this is like, so this was Facebook responding very quickly but badly, and then it was taking all this other stuff. You know, platforms have a role to play because, like it or not, we use them.
Yeah.
But they need to be genuinely held to account in a more structural way. They need to be looked at as having this, you know, whether it's, you know, whatever country you're operating in, you need to have an adequate number of speakers of the language who knows the context. Because, you know, the idea of like, and then it's moving more and more towards automation because it's cheaper and quicker.
Yeah.
As I know, but we'll learn, you know, our test data will expand, so our algorithms will get cleverer.
Yeah,
but language,
what happens if there's a genocide in between times?
Yeah, but also our language changes really quickly.
And I think, though, that's part of the education piece, right? Because there's the danger that by education, we mean, you know, Facebook put like a banner or a disclaimer on certain posts, but then these things happen in a reactive fashion and then you don't see the unintended consequences, as Nik was saying. But I think the other thing people need to understand about is the technical literacy about, one, what algorithms can and can't do. Because I can't count the amount of conferences where I've sat and had very important people say, well, and like almost word for word, well, platforms can just, you know, fix this with, you know, algorithm, machine learning, and that work. And you don't understand that algorithms can't understand cultural context in that way.
Yeah.
But Facebook are the main culprit in the current situation where, because they react in a way that says, you know, any problem at all, they say, oh, we'll fix it. They don't have a principled stand to say, well, actually, this is a bigger cultural issue and we need to work out how to deal with this as a society. We didn't, you know, kind of expect to be in this position, which Twitter historically did. I don't really know anymore. But so that's one of the issues where people run to, you know, again, say tech companies fix this and don't quite consider, you know, like you said earlier, like what happens when, you know, the people running the tech companies aren't necessarily, you know, on your political persuasion, or there's so many variables there that once we set up these structures and mechanisms, I mean, like you see it all the time now on Facebook where people try and share things even in Scotland, and because of the URL it gets blocked. And this is just something that people kind of post and laugh about now, but that's like, this is the main way people interact with each other, and like, which is terrifying in of itself. But that's how the literacy can't just be about, you know, interpreting media, but also the limits of the technology and all those factors as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I up until very, very recently worked for a major internet service provider, and at a conference maybe about 4 years ago, I went up to the guy that's like the head of tech and said to him what's coming. He said to me that basically what will be coming in the very near future is that everybody will have free access to the internet, but you'll buy packs, and one of the packs will be like the social media pack and the gaming pack. And
well, they do that in Portugal.
yeah, so
already,
suppose what I was going to ask was that does that sound like a bad idea? Because what they're doing is putting the internet behind a paywall, and but they do that already to some regard. But what will that mean for things like, you know, not the big social media companies that are not included in these packs that BT, Virgin and Sky plan to sell to their customers? Like, are we just basically going to shut off the rest of the internet and it's just going to be...
they could try, but like, I mean, you can watch Netflix Canada in the UK. There's any technical kind of limitation like that will be
Somebody will
bypassed.
find
I mean,
bypass.
China, for example, the Great Firewall of China, people consistently find ways around that. But I think the danger of that is that for people like my granda, he isn't going to be able to do it. And so the questions like polarization everyone become much more prominent, because then, you know, exactly what's included in this pack? Are you going to get the Daily Mail, you know, the Spectator, you know, access to 4chan perhaps, which is currently what people, you know, do anyway. So maybe there isn't even a huge difference in the content that people are consuming in that regard, because they go on the web and they go to the places they want to go. And I think even without that, we've got a big problem of the segregation of people's attention.
We're going to have like a 2-tier system in the real world and online.
Yeah, because that'll be like, some people will be canny enough to know how to circumvent, others won't. And so then you'll have 2-tiered system. I mean, Portugal does it because they have no net neutrality baseline, so that you can providers, and this your engagement with the internet is still mediated through the providers. So you're still at the mercy of these very
just the fact that we can't get onto Pirate Bay, for instance, you know, like they have websites that we can't access, so it does exist already.
But not necessarily. Like I guess not in the sort of packet ideas. But there's still stuff. Again, I mean,
because it's like if a government doesn't like 4chan, for instance, they're like, well, that doesn't go in the pack. Well, you know, like that's the
but I mean, in the UK, it's arguably harder to do that. I would say the rule of law here is still, you know, and there is still currently. This is gonna age really badly.
We'll get it out quick.
Ultimately, it's going to be very hard for that to be, you know, any meaningful attempts to expand the idea of delisting or removing.
I'd like that time stamped so I can come back to it.
There'll be a bill announced tomorrow. It'll be.
We won't even get home. Done it, like, fuck.
So, oh, sorry, on you.
No. I think it said I sort of tend to do that a lot.
Fair enough.
mean, they tried it though with the filters, and they had some success. Can't even remember how long ago it was now, but was it under David Cameron? I'm sure it was.
Yeah.
They brought out, you know,
That's true, actually.
Child safe. You know, it's always done under the auspices of protecting children.
Was this because I worked at the time, the automatic child safety that was on, so that when you purchased broadband, you didn't get access it, you couldn't access over 18 material, and to actually get that lifted seemed quite difficult.
It happens on your phone still. If you sign up, you have to prove that you're over 18.
Verified.
But the thing about that was that it later came out that it also included, like, the big list of stuff. It wasn't just, you know, over 8, like Pornhub.com or something like that. It was esoteric content that was listed in the, I can't remember if it was in statute or not, it's been a while, but this was part of the stuff that the government was blocking access to. So it's not a theoretical, you know, these things have been implemented to some degree. I was in America, had my phone, and it was when, or maybe it was in Europe, where the, you know, mobile charges not active at that point, and I tried to show my pal who I worked with something, and it was my friend's blog, ironically, which we host, and it came up and it said, oh, you can't access this because it's an adult site. I was like, oh, fuck, I'm not signing into that thing. And my American pal, he was like, what is that? Why can't you access that on your phone? I was like, oh, it's an ISP filter. And he, like, it blew his mind. But here it's yet another thing.
Yeah, we just accept and move on.
Yeah.
With.
Yeah. Protecting children.
Some people don't even know. Some people probably don't even know.
Yeah.
It's because they only look at nice
It's the-
websites.
PG
But
websites.
it's also it's the Helen Lovejoy thing, you know, because we talk, and you know, things like, I mean, end-to-end encryption is going to be the next thing. That's
so that
gonna
was
be
getting talked
just-
about last week, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it's they've been talking about it for fucking years.
Aye.
And the G7 are talking about it. The Five Eyes are talking about it. It will be. I think there'll be some attempt, and then they'll realize it's impossible because all of our online banking, online shopping depends on end-to-end encryption. WhatsApp are not going to be very kind and develop a way where you can have end-to-end encrypted everywhere except for the UK, unless we want to follow China's lead and geofence.
Yeah.
But again, this is always said like that. This is also the problem with framing, and not just framing of the government, framing from some of the activists as well. Like, so they're pitting the right to privacy against the rights of children, but we're not talking about the rights to privacy of children.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they have the same human rights. You know, our human rights, we don't get them when we turn 18. We always have them. And they're not really meaningfully involved in the conversation. I used to do workshops in schools in Scotland around sort of surveillance policy.
Right.
And it was a really interesting thing because it sort of feels like they're never really entered into the conversation. They're never actually talked to about this conversation. Whereas they're, you know, I've got a cousin who's, how old is he now? 18. But like when he was 13, he was already like, just how much he knew about the technology just blew me away. But his entire life has been not just internet, it's been wireless. When he was really young, I played him the dial-up tone from an old, and I had to convince him. It took me ages to convince him that you couldn't use the internet if someone was on the phone.
Yeah.
And he really thought I was pulling his leg. And you know, and these kids are not being incorporated into this discussion. So when I was talking, and you know, but I learned so much about their interests in surveillance. You know, a lot of them were very, to be honest, a lot of them were very like laissez-faire about the state. You know, they'd accepted the state will surveil you, and it's like it's part of the world they live in. They were all born after 9/11, so you know their entire existence has been this heightened sense of fear around terrorism.
I'm just stuck on a 13-year-old who's laissez-faire.
but then when I talked to them, I was talking to them all about like, you know, optic nerve or fiber optic, the GCHQ program that hacked every Yahoo user in the UK and took a photo off their camera every minute, I think it was, which turns out, I think they may have the largest collection of amateur pornography in the world, because literally people walking past their laptops get changed or having...
Did I have a Yahoo?
So yeah, they've got you. Or people, you know, having consensual sex via laptops and stuff. And I thought that scares the fuck out of me. And they were sort of like, you know, not because they didn't care, but because I guess they'd always been very... This is the world they were brought up in. And also kids have a very direct concept of surveillance. You know, for us, it may be the tech companies or GCHQ or whatever. For them, it's their parents or older siblings or teachers. So their surveillors are, and you know, all surveillance is not bad. You know, parental care is a good thing. But then when I talk to them about the idea that what you post could be seen by a potential employer, they got really worried by that.
Yeah.
And that worries me because, you know, you shouldn't have to worry. You shouldn't have to obscure yourself for an employer.
Yeah.
But I don't know whether that's the rhetoric around, you know, austerity, this sort of idea. I mean, we've heard ministers talking about you go to education to become basically employable.
Yeah.
And that's been internalized so much that any risk to employment is
shocking.
We're actually like self-censoring our own right to free speech and expression because in one day in the future it may negatively impact us.
Yeah, and that's really worrying.
Yeah.
And
But that shows like the change of the internet in the past. Like, you know, I mean, was one of the first people in my school to get a modem.
Right.
Primary school, can't remember. It was 28k Motorola thing, AOL. And
AOL.
I think there was one other person before me, or maybe two. But that was when I was 20 something years ago, right? But the internet has like massively changed. It used to be something that was around
Very
interest
much.
groups, you know, like I mentioned, forums and stuff. People,
GeoCities and
aye,
such like.
well, you would do your terrible website, your HTML
Napster.
blink tags and all that. But then it changed with Facebook, and you know the way that Facebook expanded and kind of consumed everything, and that changed. I mean, judges and lawyers didn't know what the internet was like 15 years ago. They had no, well, maybe a bit longer now, but
Yeah.
you get the idea. And so as we come to kind of grips with the impact technology, well, the internet specifically has got on society, then the role of it's going to change. And I'm curious about, you know, when you grow up with the web as an all-pervasive thing, at what point, you know, is the future going to change the questions we're asking now, in the sense of the internet won't be the kind of, so, you know, I would hope perhaps that we don't rely on the internet as our sole means of expression.
Yeah.
Is what I'm trying to say. Because I think we did, and especially over the past year, because we've had no choice.
Yeah.
But I think as you come out of it, you realise, well, actually, I don't want to talk to my pal about politics on Twitter. I would rather go have a drink, and like then you can see them and tell them, shut up, you're being an idiot, rather than like do that online, and then next thing you've got like
Getting a lot of
few
hate. I mean,
hatefulness.
I've said so many times and during podcasts that engaging with certain people on Twitter would be like walking down the street and engaging with a lunatic that's standing up with the Bible and screaming, and it's like it's pointless. And
It
you
might
know
be
that
him.
in real life, you know that in real life. That's it. Like you walk and we make like instantaneous judgments of people based on how they look, how they're carrying themselves, how they walk. You don't get any of that on Twitter, or that everybody's the same.
Yeah.
And you assume that you're dealing with a very stable and, you know, like educated person. You could be, in fact, you could be speaking to a robot. You know, you're screaming into the void, and it's like such a waste of energy.
I think that's
for
part
people,
of what
you know, like,
is making the dissemination of the disinformation that we're talking about so easy. I put a question in. We're obviously getting towards sort of wrapping up time. You touched on it just there. How much worse has disinformation made the pandemic?
I would say worse, because public health shit and medical shit is hard. It's complicated. And it's not always perfect. You know, so much of science is trying to know. I mean, by its design, it's not meaning it's failing. It's just, you know, there's always going to be these processes. Some things to work, some things don't work. You know, I've had friends who've fallen down the sort of anti-vax black hole. And it starts off, and they're not sort of right-wing, or, you know, they were, I would say, ostensibly left-wing, sort of and also this sort of weird hippie sort of thing. And, you know, when I was talking to him about it, he's like, oh yeah, but these pharma companies are the devil, you know, and stuff. It's like, yes, and, you know, I agree with you, the corporations behind so many of these are hugely problematic. But sometimes they make good shit that works.
Yes.
yeah.
And, you know, and then I was seeing some of the stuff that him and his friends were sharing. It were these stories of someone who'd cured themselves of cancer by eating just lemongrass.
Right.
One, I think that's incredibly insulting to those who have, you know, who are suffering it, and then get. I mean, there's this recent story I read today about this Australian influencer who had said that she had had cancer and she'd cured it through just pure natural remedies, and people who were following her. One person who I think the BBC interviewed was following her had cancer, and she was going through chemo, and you know, chemo, it's horrible. I mean, the treatment itself is so, you know, obviously it can cure the cancer, but it leaves you. It's incredibly
can kill the person as well. You know, it's that bad.
and it's you know, and so she saw this person, looking very healthy, very, you know, sort of stuff, and she was in so much pain. She basically stopped that and tried to. Then it came out recently that this woman never had cancer. This influencer never had cancer. It was a pure fiction.
Steve Jobs was a victim of that as well, wasn't he? I mean, it wasn't until very near the end that he got actual medical. Like before that, he was trying to do like, you know, water fasts and all sorts of mad shit.
But the thing is, like, there is a danger. There's a real danger to it because it's so complex. And things like pharma companies, that yes, you can dislike the corporate structure that builds our medication. We can look at how unequally distributed it is across the globe. But that doesn't mean that it's throwing the baby out of the bathwater. Like, doesn't mean, like drugs, there are natural remedies for things that, help build your immune system. We have not found anything really that will cure cancer in the same way, or things like that. And it's disingenuous to suggest that just because they are problematic corporate processes, that things are there. So
They're almost looked at in very similar terms to the way you were describing journalists, in a sense, where they're an overarching distrust because they seem to exist in quite a large capacity. But
that's what I think is key, though, because I think that disinformation has definitely made the pandemic worse in some regard, but I think the focus on disinformation is like missing the point, because there's plenty of false, statements and misleading information, to avoid the loaded terms, on websites that nobody looks at, right? I mean, you'll get complaints and legislation trying to target things that are wrong, but nobody looks at them. So is that the problem? To me, it seems that the core problem is the amplification and the validation of how people feel already, and that makes it worse and it spreads to other people. But by tackling disinformation or fake news or whatever, we don't tackle the core kind of reasons for people's distrust in government. Why did people vote for Trump? It wasn't just they were scared of black people or they were scared of the other. That they already were, and it might have been whipped up. But there was also plenty of places in Middle America whose industries have been destroyed, who have been let down by politicians of generations. None of that was addressed. Trump promised them a way out, and of course he didn't deliver it and never was going to.
No.
But by focusing, myopically on disinformation, we are at risk of not addressing all this. I mean, you talked about it earlier, lack of trust. And
I think it's like, if we can, and it sounds really sappy, if we can sort of strengthen our democratic processes and structures and institutions and the sort of civic space within which we can learn, disagree, all that stuff, if we can build genuine accountability and transparency toward like the corporate systems, political systems, the technological systems we work in, that will do more to tackle disinformation. We're always going to get disinformation. You're talking about military.
So it's more a symptom rather than a cause.
But we can maybe limit how disruptive it is. We can stop it won't carry as much power when we have systems that we trust are working for our interest and are responsive to our concerns and are accountable to us. I think that is something that these bills don't attempt to even come close to. I mean, we're talking about these bills. We have no idea what the legislative framework that the UK government will bring forward. I think it will be something based on NetzDG. I mean, they tried to do NetzDG on hate speech. I don't know if they're still trying to do it. Whereas NetzDG in Germany, you have 24 hours to take down a post. I think the UK were like, that's too long.
Yeah, we'll do
like 4 hours or 6 hours.
Even nowadays, the fact that they take it down is confirmation that somehow it's real and that it's true. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like now it's like, well, look, they took it down. Why did they take it down?
Yeah, exactly.
And it comes back to the distrust. And
Exactly.
And being
They
sensible.
fill in these blanks with their own wants, needs, emotions.
But that is
confirmation bias.
That's kind of what I mentioned earlier about the danger of presenting an overlay or something, like you go to click on something that says this may be unverified or whatever. I don't know if you're like me, but I'm like, well, fuck you, I'm going to bloody well read it, And the danger of the reaction against, also removal is not the only legislative thing. Not everybody is looking for removal. The flip side of this is that there is a push, especially in the Republican side at the moment in the US, to stay-up laws, which basically argue that they're a common carrier, Facebook, etc., are common carriers, and that they can't moderate anything. They have to leave up because they believe that there's a bias against conservatives,
right?
And that comes with its own challenges and pretty huge flaws. But it's not just always about removal, and that I think that's important to say because it's people want to leave up information that might counter what they perceive to be misinformation.
And that's really interesting because it comes back to what you were saying earlier, like both exist at the same time, because the left are being like it's biased towards the right and the right are being it's biased towards the left, and there's just a load of people in the middle
Back
just
when we
going,
started with fake news, aren't we? We're both pointing at each other.
yeah, like the Spider-Man meme, but
Yeah.
load of people in the middle that just really don't know what to make of all
No way
this.
we didn't
Yeah.
get through it.
And
that's worrying, 'cause, it is really
Dominic
unfortunate.
Cummings there.
Because like the people in the middle, so many people may want support, may want help as to how to navigate this stuff. They hear about these headlines about disinformation, and they read about it, but it's and if we just look at the two, like the Republicans' position, I think Republicans' position, if it ever came to fruition, well, one, it would destroy Facebook and Twitter, that it wouldn't, they wouldn't. Those social media platforms would not.
Porn, spam, you can remove anything.
Yeah,
if you're under a
exactly.
common
And also,
carrier.
you were talking about child abuse imagery.
Yeah.
Like, we already exist in a world of censored, if you want to call it that, or mediated content. And there's generally everyone has a level with which they're fine. Even the Republicans, who are the stay up orders, there's so much stuff they want to talk about. They're also, while at the same time, talking about communist infiltration of education and critical race theory. So, so we already, and even ignoring that stuff, we're not seeing generally a great deal of child abuse imagery online. That's easy to find. We're not seeing very many beheading videos, So there is. Well, yeah, you are.
Every day.
You're like, was it a sin eater? You're doing
No,
it.
good,
You're seeing it all, so no one else has to. And then of course there's degrees beyond that where there's always going to be conversations as to whether it's acceptable, and everyone has different. Me and Stephen I've agreed with what Stephen's talked about. But if we were literally building a policy, I imagine there's probably a lot that we would disagree with on where the line would be. I also think we need to have better conversations about freedom of expression. At the moment, it is just a stick to beat people around the head with. We need genuine, in-depth, complex conversations about freedom of expression. Most of the shit there is in the grey area, and it's really complicated. It's really inconsistent at times, and it's hard to get your head around. And it will mean that you may support things that you don't really support, but for the basis of freedom of expression, you see why it's placed. We need to have genuine conversations about it, not part of this cultural narrative, not part of someone who's just trying to justify, well, I want to say the N-word. We need to actually have genuine conversations about this. The one worry I always have with freedom of expression is always framed in terms of like case law or jurisprudence or things like that, precedents. So like the neo-Nazis in what's that place? Not Charlottesville, but previous one. So it was about neo-Nazis marching through.
Three torch guys.
Yeah, but this was like in the 60s. I can't remember where it was. But yeah, but we always talk about the very fringe cases, the real sort of like, do neo-Nazis have right to free speech, white supremacists, sort of stuff. And that they're important conversations to be had. But, we don't all live in a world of like case law. We're not always going to look at pushing that. People who are not white supremacists, whose conversations about freedom of expression are a lot more straightforward, don't really see themselves included in the conversation because it's always framed on that. So while legally we need to have those conversations, but we need to be able to talk to it on a personal level about what this right means. Because it collides with other rights all the time.
Yeah.
We're fine with defamation law, and that's a collision of freedom of expression with the right to privacy. But then it's all the nuances, all the details.
And that's kind of the summation. It's like there isn't any good answers to any of it.
Yeah.
But I think the one good, obvious thing that people need to take from any discussion about this is that you need to approach things with caution, including discussions about what to do about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to say, well, it's easy to see something as bad and call for it to be removed, or call for something that is, in your mind manifestly correct to remain. But the complexity and the longer term impacts of that out with your own sphere is like incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And, outside of Facebook, then there's most companies and actors involved in things aren't looking to, perhaps Cambridge Analytica. But yeah, there are lots of people involved in discussions that don't have, completely vested interest.
Aye, a lot of this stuff that we've touched on, data and, you know, these information, a lot of issues for very mundane, like corporate purposes that are absolutely no threat to us whatsoever. It's about the other side. I think, you know, having listened to you and getting about it tonight, like we maybe asked the wrong question, didn't we, about disinformation? It sounds as though we're probably going to need about 4 or 5 episodes now to go into all the other various bits and bobs that we've come to, but at least it has been an education in that regard.
Just imagine how much fun we are in the pub.
Yeah, but I think that if
I would
nothing
certainly
else,
have fun.
if nothing else, if people, you know, like that are listeners, you know, just to them to go, well, this is so complex and it's not quite as simple as just deleting shit off of social media or getting Facebook to buck up their ideas or getting Mark Zuckerberg. It's like when I watch that, it's like, what the fuck does he know about? You know,
what's going on in
one
Challenge?
guy.
Guy started a website to get students laid.
Exactly, like, and you're expecting them to answer these questions that are like very complex and nuanced, and he's just sitting there probably just shitting himself, not want to go to jail, you know. But
also, like, the takedown, this rush to take down means that we've lost, you know, hours of evidence of war crimes in Syria, because a lot of that was uploaded to YouTube because there weren't that many journalists there, and it was easier for activists on the ground to film. They fell foul of YouTube. I think it was YouTube's filtering, and they've been literally deleted, and that could be used. And I think there are lawyers who are saying that would have been evidence that could have been used in a pending war crimes tribunal and things like that.
So the law needs to catch up pretty quickly here.
Yeah, and there's been calls on, you know, if you're deleting it, just don't make it visible, but have it in the background for researchers, you know, lawyers, you know, all that sort of stuff. You know, there are degrees to how you want to look at this. You know, they don't have to just delete and literally then empty the trash bin.
Yeah,
like, and
surprising that Google did that. You know,
and it's a huge issue. And again, it's because the safety conversation trumps everything else. And whether it's advertising revenue or educational relationships with big like school providers, the safety side is always the thing that trumps. And, you know, we need to actually say, like, you know, I'm not saying kids should see beheading videos at all. I'm not saying that. But again, other people would find that useful. And there's ways that you can provide that.
And maybe provide people on the ground a specific type of account that means that their content is not immediately uploaded for public consumption or something like that. I am with you. You getting else?
No, man, I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too.
And I consider myself enlightened in
Definitely.
a lot of ways that even my focus on it is going to just shift straight away to something that's not what I thought we were going to be talking about. You know,
It might just be the heat in here.
Yeah,
certainly. These lights don't help, do they?
At least it's not Vancouver.
Stephen, did I see you post something about an album this week? You were talking about music earlier on, so you want to get your plug in?
Oh,
yeah, for sure, man.
plug.
I mean, we do a lot of, like, you know, music acts and stuff. Yeah, that's one of our.
I make lots of music. I play in a band called Closet Organ.
Closet Organ.
Closet Organ.
You can read into that what you want. Another band called Hog Wild with a Y. It was kind of like a Churches situation, which there was another band called Hog Wild in Edinburgh who play country music. So we had to change it subtly to a Y. Like Churches in the V.
So how do people find you? SoundCloud?
Oh yeah, I should have thought about this. We're on YouTube. We've got 10 subscribers.
I curveball there because I get chinned when we were booking the guests originally. I'd followed all the various accounts, and he dug me out on Twitter for no following his organ band. So I thought, here's your moment. It was a jokey comment, so it was like, here's your moment. Let's go with let's get Closet Organ out there.
Twitter.com/Closet Organ.
It's a good name for a band.
It's an exceptional name. But thanks very much for coming in, guys. It's been amazing to talk to you. Really.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks.